first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm fantastically honored to be given this honorific title and from such a illustrious organization, institution of higher learning. I was very impressed when I got the news from Andre, but then I was doubly impressed when I emailed with Philippe and he told me this was his alma mater. So, then the honor became squared. But I'm not telling you whether it was greater than one or less than one first. So this is a great place to be, and it's a pleasure to talk about some new work, which is joined with Pascual Restrepo. The original paper I said I was going to present is Demographics and Robots. It's sort of the other side of this paper. This one is about the effects of robots empirically, and that paper looks at the determinants. But there is no the paper for that one is still under construction, and so since I thought it would be nice to post a paper, I decided to talk about this one. So what is this paper about? So I guess there is enough talk about this issue in the press that probably you can guess. A lot of people are talking about the implications of automation in general, robotics, AI, and whether those changes have already started influencing the labor market, and in what way they are going to continue to impact our lives in various different ways, including as suppliers of labor. So there is already a bit of a literature claiming that automation process, at least the earlier phases of it, for example, the introduction of computer-assisted, numerically assisted machinery, automation of routine tasks, for example, have had an important contribution to wage inequality. Others have claimed that this is also related to increase in joblessness. We know that in the US, for example, employment to population ratio is down. In many European countries, there has been several decades of relatively low job creation. But of course, fears about technology are nothing new. And in some sense, if you want to simplify it a little bit, you can see that on one end, at one end of the scale, you have some academics, such as Eric Boehringer-Lufsen, my colleague, Andy McAfee, at the Sloan School at MIT, and many, many commentators who are talking about how these quote-unquote brilliant technologies are going to transform everything and perhaps leave us without jobs. And at the other end of the scale, many economists are a little bit blasé about it. And the economist's argument is, well, we know technology has always been a driver for higher wages, the most important engine of progress, and we have been here before. Others have sort of worried about technology creating joblessness. Here is Keynes in his famous Economics for Our Grandchildren essay, predicting that there will be steady growth in the next 100 years, but also predicting incorrectly that we will be afflicted by technological unemployment as machines become better. Leontiev making similar pronouncements, both in the 50s and again in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, that just, this view that there will be jobs for everybody is just too optimistic. But the fact that these things have been said before and didn't turn out to be right doesn't mean that, the new technologies that we're talking about cannot have negative consequences. In particular, once we go out of a framework, which is one of the main things I'm going to be doing here, in which we can think of technology as a monolithic sort of entity that always has the same types of effects on labor. And in particular, industrial robots is just one of the ensemble of new technologies powered by the computer chip, ranging from all of these earlier automation technologies and more recently AI, that are potentially affecting firms and potentially affecting employment. So what do I mean by industrial robots? So I'm going to take the definition from the Industrial Federation of Robotics, whose data we're going to be using. And this is a good definition, not because it is comprehensive, it's a good definition because it's sort of comparable across countries. So there are many things that are similar to robots that are not going to be in our analysis. For us, robots are automatically controlled, reprogrammable, and multi-purpose autonomous machines. They have been spreading relatively rapidly, starting from essentially a very, very low base in the early 1990s. They have made pretty spectacular inroads in the production process in Germany, Japan, South Korea. All three of these countries are probably about almost a decade ahead of, for example, the United States in terms of how much robotics has been integrated into the production process. There are some specific industries in which we see robots playing more of a role. The automotive industry is the leading one. So this picture is from the Hyundai plant where you see no workers. Pretty much all of the assembly and related tasks are being performed by robots here. So most of the car is being put together by robots. But there are also important use of robotics in electronics, metal products, plastics, and chemicals. And this is all set to grow. Here are some data. So the United States is the one in triangles. And in fact, the US is not just behind South Korea, Japan, and Germany, but it's behind the average of Europe. So here the pink circles are 7 European countries for which we have consistent data at the industry and the country level. So France is in here, Belgium, Italy, Spain, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. So, and the UK. So I guess 9 countries, 9, not 7, sorry, 9 European countries. But you can see the trend in all of these places. There's some slowdown with the recession, but it continues to grow. Now, unfortunately, we don't know much about the effects of automation in general. And part of the reason for that is that from an economics point of view, what we care about isn't the easy question to answer. So there are a lot of studies that show, you can automate these tasks, you can automate those functions, et cetera. So you can call them feasibility studies. They are about what given technology you may or may not be able to do in a given task or in a given job. But that's not going to be informative about the equilibrium effects of new technologies because, of course, you might be able to automate a particular task, but then workers then get reallocated to another task. And if there is enough dynamism in the economy, and depending on the nature of technologies in a way that I'm going to try to clarify, that might actually be very good for employment, very good for wages. So we need to have a sort of a strategy for estimating the equilibrium impact of robots, and there is no substitute for that unless you want to put amazingly strong assumptions. There's no really substitute for that other than exploit cross-market variation. So that's what we're going to try to do in the US context today. So first, we're going to start with some simple theory. This theory essentially, Francis was already sort of referring to some of the ingredients of this. The main ingredient is going to be reasoning at the level of the tasks. And I'm going to clarify why that's important in a second. So we're going to start with a task-based framework that draws on my earlier work with Outer and earlier work with Pasquale. And then we're going to show that within that framework, under essentially minimal reasonable assumptions, we end up with a very simple way of reasoning about the effects of robots or more broadly automation technologies. And is this? And in particular, it says that we can relate change in employment and change in wage in a local labor market C to a bunch of controls and a measure that we're going to call exposure to robots. So if this exposure to robots was randomly assigned to labor markets, then you could estimate their effects and have essentially most of the economically relevant impacts that you want from such regressions. And what is exposure to robots? Exposure to robots turns out to be a very intuitive object also, and it's quite a simple one. And it's essentially, even if you didn't have a theory, this is what you might have started with on the basis of some sort of Bartik reasoning. It is the robot penetration in industry I. So this sort of exploits the fact that, oops, pressed the wrong thing. Is this here? Here it is?
No.
Oh, I made even more of a mess.
This one.
Oh, that one, okay.
Yeah.
All right. I should be careful about what. So I've already told you there are major differences across industries in how easy it is for robots to penetrate, to spread. And so it's going to exploit that. And also baseline industry shares in the local labor market of those industries. So how much exposure you're going to have given the distribution of employment in your local labor market. Now, of course, this is not randomly assigned at the level of a local labor market, and there are many potential issues of endogeneity we have to worry about. But right off the bat, one thing that we can do is follow the China imports paper by David Otter, David Dorn, and Gordon Hansen. And even better in this setting, exploiting the fact that US, as I've told you, is a follower, we can exploit what's going on at the frontier of robots adoption in countries in Europe, for example. Okay, so we're going to instrument that with robotics penetration in different industries in Europe. So that resolves some of the endogeneity issues. It doesn't resolve any endogeneity issues that exists because there was something that different commuting zones that house different industries were on differential trends, or it doesn't deal with the issue that globally robots happen to go into industries that have other reasons for contracting, and then we're going to deal with all of those in the empirical work. Okay. Now, without further ado, I'm going to jump into the model and the estimation, but to say just a very quick outline, we're going to find that robots do indeed have negative effects on employment and wages. So both theoretically and empirically, the presumption that exists in some parts of the economics literature that somehow technology always has to be good for labor is clearly rejected. And I'm going to show you that this is a very robust result. And in fact, when you start thinking about it from first principles, I would argue this is exactly what you should have expected. But also we're going to see that the quantitative magnitudes, though reasonable, are nowhere close to what you would think would be something that heralds the end of work or anything like that. So these are negative effects, but it's a small part of the employment decline in the United States. So the question is, how was the adjustment to these sort of shocks will take place, and then we'll perhaps talk about that in the end. So let me not say much about the related literature, except highlight the paper by Grates and Michaels, which also uses IFR data, but a very different strategy to look at the effects of robots, cross-industry, cross-country variation, and this cool paper by Greenlee and Kraft, whose data I'm going to use also. So let me talk about them later. So here is the model. At some level, the model is extremely simple, and it is really a close cousin of models that people have used in a trade setting. But it has quite sharply different predictions given the specific way in which I'm going to model technology. So the new thing here is how to model technology. And this is where I'm building on my previous work with David Otter and Pasquale. So in particular, we're going to think of a world that consists of a bunch of local labor markets. So I'm going to denote each one of them by C. And I'm going to refer to them as commuting zones rather than labor markets, because that's how we're going to measure them in the data. And I'll tell you more about what commuting zones are in a second. So each commuting zone is going to produce a final good YC. And it's going to do that by combining the output of several industries. So you can think of industries as, cars, chemicals, restaurants, and so on and so forth. And then all of those enter into a final good or enter into the utility function of the households. Here I'm going to make it simple, and I'm going to assume that these are combined with a CES, with sigma being the elasticity of substitution. So in some sense, sigma is a little bit like Farid's eta. It's the elasticity of substitution across different products. Alpha I is how important that industry is. It's a share parameter. So that could vary across commuting zones, but here I've imposed that it's the same. Okay. So the key thing I'm doing now, which I'm going to relax in a little bit, is I'm going to assume that these commuting zones are not trading. So each commuting zone constructs its final good from the industries that it itself houses. Okay? That's, of course, crazy if you want to take it as a literal description. In the US, different cities, of course, trade a huge amount. So I'll come to that in a second. Okay. Now, here is the new sort of the task-based framework aspect comes in. Each industry produces its output by combining a set of tasks, which I have normalized to be the same across all industries, running from 0 to capital S. Little s denotes a task. And the output of each industry is a Leontief aggregate of the tasks that need to be performed. So if you want to produce a textile good, you need to do spinning, you need to do weaving, you need to do drawing, you need to do carding, you need to do coloring, you need to do cleaning, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these tasks need to be performed. Now I'm simplifying things here by saying they are Leontief. That's totally without any importance. Nothing really depends on that except you'll get one more parameter if you say make that a CES. Now the more important thing is in this next equation. So this is where the rabbit goes into the hat. Okay? So this says that the output of task S in industry I commuting zone C depends on whether a task has or has not been automated. So in particular, if you look at tasks greater than MI in industry I, they have not been automated. So therefore, the way you produce a task is gamma times LCIS. LCIS is the labor that you allocate to task S in industry I commuting zone C. Now, if this is the only thing I had, this would be very classic in terms of how technology is modeled. And in particular, we would think of technology as we do in many other economic settings as a labor augmenting, Harrod neutral shifter. So gamma increases and a higher gamma translates into higher productivity. And in general, a higher gamma also translates into higher wages. So that is the basis of the presumption that in general, technology, which we often model as labor augmenting, is going to imply not just greater productivity, but it's going to imply greater wages and greater labor demand. So we have a very happy sort of existence with technology. And when people sort of go through this sort of thing in their lectures and point out why Keynes was wrong, they derive implications from a model like this. But the crucial difference here, and this is sort of what a task-based model sort of directs you towards, is that we are not just looking at gamma, but we're looking at another type of technological change, which is this MI here. So what does this MI do? Well, MI is the extensive margin between automated and non-automated tasks. And for automated tasks, in addition to using labor, you could use machines. And for machines here, I'm going to take robots. So RCIS is the number of robots I used in producing tasks S in industry I, country, or commuting zone C. And the crucial thing is that once a task has been automated, so for tasks less than MI, robots and labor are perfect substitutes. That's the additive production function. So in the aggregate, the elasticity of substitution, not that this will be a constant elasticity of substitution world, but if you measure the elasticity of substitution locally, would be varying and will be endogenous. But within a task, it's infinite. Okay. So that's the sense in which this is going to be a world in which there is clear automation, because automation will happen, and if they are cheaper, robots will take the tasks away from labor. In the same way that if you go back to that Hyundai factory 10 years ago, you would have seen lots of laborers on the factory floor. They're not there anymore. That's exactly what this is. So there is a close connection between the model at some level and the phenomenon we're trying to model. How much? What time do I go to?
You have till
12:15. Okay, I better go a little bit faster. Okay, all right. And then we close the model by having supply of robots and supply of labor at the local labor market. An important assumption is that we assume the supply of robots is also not fully elastic at the local labor market, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay? So let me now show you the effects of robots before jumping into the data and the empirical work. So first of all, let me define a crucial object, which is this thing here. So pi c is going to be the cost-saving gains from using robots. What is it? It's 1 minus QC, which is the price of robots, divided by WC over gamma. What is QC? QC is how much does it cost if you want to perform a task by using a robot. And what is WC over gamma? It's how much it costs if you want to produce a task using labor. So the ratio of the two is for automated tasks or for automatable tasks, how attractive it is from a cost-saving perspective to do so. Okay? So if pi c is negative, doesn't make sense to use robots. If pi c is positive, it's profitable to use robots. If pi c is very large, then it's really a great deal. Okay? All right. So first, let me assume that pi c is positive so that I don't draw a distinction between tasks that can be automated and tasks that are automated in equilibrium. That's what we do in the general theoretical work that we do, but here it's not important. The more important thing is what's the effects of robots. And this is the partial equilibrium effect, in a sense that I'll make it clear 1 second. It says, let me hold prices constant, so don't link prices and output to technology. Let me look at the effects of technology holding prices constant and the effects of prices, etc. And this is an exact equation that links labor demand in a local labor market in a commuting zone to these three components. The red one, which is negative, which we call the displacement effect. It is how much labor demand changes holding other things constant when I shift the extensive margin of automation. And it's always negative because of this replacement aspect. What I'm doing is that I am replacing workers in the tasks that were previously performing by machines. Okay? And LCI denotes the share of employment in industry I in commuting zone I. So you are already seeing something like what I call the exposure to robots, because the effects of changes in the extensive margin of robotics affects a local labor market as a function of how they house different industries. But of course, if I just focused on the red term, it would be a cardinal sin for an economist, and my license to practice economics will be taken away, because when you change technology, you change prices and you change output. And those are the next two terms. The blue one is what we call the price productivity effect, and that's what already Farid talked about. When you introduce robots, say, into the car industry, what happens is that you have cost savings. That comes from the first assumption. It says it's cheaper to use robots. So therefore, that's going to reduce the prices of cars. That means that then the cars are going to expand. People are going to start using more cars instead of other things. And the effects of that is regulated by sigma, the elasticity of substitution between different products. But then there's also a scale productivity effect, which is that when we have this productivity gains, we also make ourselves richer, and a richer consumer wants to consume all products more. So therefore, there will be a labor drawn to other industries also. So if you think of iconic examples in history where people think that there was important technological advances, but things worked out, actually there's some question mark whether they're right or not, but like the mechanization of agriculture, what happens is that agriculture becomes more productive, people become richer, and they want to consume more products, and that's where labor demand gets sucked. Okay? Now, this is partial equilibrium, but it's not that hard to put it in general equilibrium. Now you have the supplies, and then you can close things, and so you end up with this sort of expression. And let me just focus on wages. Now this is the general equilibrium or equilibrium displacement effect. It gets amplified by eta, and this is the productivity effect, and you can see the role that pi c is playing. So this combines the general equilibrium version of the price productivity and scale productivity effect. Right off the bat, there's an important implication. In equilibrium, the effects of robots or other automation technologies need not be negative. It can be negative, it can be positive. It's two effects going against each other. I'm emphasizing more the negative part because somehow some economists are incredulous about it, but it's quite routine that it can happen. But the positive part is important also, and one thing that it says is that the greater is pi c, the greater are the cost savings, the more likely it is to be positive. That's very important because, though quite intuitive when you think about it, it's the opposite of what pretty much all of the popular discussions presume. So if you read a lot of the popular discussions, they claim that these new technologies are going to leave people without jobs because they are so brilliant, they're so productive. Well, this basic model says that actually you have to fear not those that are very productive, but those that are marginally productive. Because if they are really productive, they create all these cost savings and they lead to expansion in other parts of the economy. If they are marginally productive, they displace workers, but they don't create the productivity effect. All right. Now, this was all to get to our empirical equation. And if you look at this equation, it still has a lot of terms that are not so easy. So it has this MI. Well, I don't measure the extensive margin of robots. And it has these SCs, labor share in commuting zone and labor share of industries, et cetera. And then it has this pi c. But it actually turns out that under a reasonable assumption, all of these things sort of drop out, and you get a very clean expression. And that reasonable assumption is that MI is not very large, meaning that we are still at the beginning of this automation process. So when MI is, say, approximately 0, then a first-order approximation essentially gives you that all of these terms cancel out, and you can also replace this DMI with the number of robots, which is what we observe in the data. So we have this term here, LSCI times DRI DLI. This is exactly the exposure to robots that I defined. The industry-level penetration of robots times the baseline shares. Okay? So now we've ended up with our empirical equation. But you can say, rightly, hang on, this is a crazy model because you have assumed that these commuting zones are islands unto themselves. They're not interacting with each other. So it's important to allow for trade. Well, it turns out that's a little messier, but it's not that hard. So if you introduce trade, for example, this is like an Armington structure where different varieties of each industry is produced in different commuting zones and then sourced to different in consumptions, they're sourced from across different commuting zones. You can get exactly the same reduced form equations, meaning that the effects look something like this, except that these parameters no longer that simple. They're more complex functions of what's going on in the economy, not just in the commuting zone. But essentially, what the way to interpret that is to say, we can still run the same regressions, but to do counterfactuals, we need to use additional structure of the trade patterns, and that's what we're going to do. Okay? So therefore, what we're going to do is throughout, we're going to now run these regressions where these coefficients, the beta L and beta W, are potentially functions of underlying rich set of parameters that depend on trade, et cetera. And then we'll do this sort of backing up in a second. All right, so we're going to use data from 722 commuting zones in the United States. Commuting zones are essentially collection of cities and counties that are approximating a labor market. So in the US, counties are very small. People live in one county and go and work in another county. So you don't want to use counties as a labor market. You don't want to use states as a labor market because states are too big. So commuting zones are in between and a lot of activity. It's very, very rare for people to live in one commuting zone and then commute and go work in another different commuting zone. But of course, there's a lot of trade. And then we're going to combine this with IFR, IRS data, census, CPS data, and so on and so forth. Okay? We're going to construct these exposure to robots. And for pretty much every country, we can construct exposure to robots going back to 1993, or we can construct industry-level data. We have for 19 industries, for pretty much any country. Sorry, for about 10 countries we can do that. For the 9 European countries that I mentioned in particular. And LCI is going to be, of course, from census using sort of past distribution of industry employment across commuting zones. We're going to stop the analysis in 2007 because I don't want to get into the interaction between robots and the recession. It turns out that everything is pretty similar after 2007, except in a 2-year period when there is readjustment, but let me not get into that unless people ask about it at the end. But there's one problem that US data, partly perhaps reflecting the fact that US is a laggard, is lower quality, so you can really get the industry composition in the US only starting in 2004. So we're going to focus for most of the analysis, in fact, pretty much everything I'm going to show you today, for the reduced form of the IV that I indicated, which is rather than regress stuff on US exposure and then instrument US exposure with European exposure, I'm just directly going to use European exposure as the right-hand side variable and then show you what happens with the IV, because the IV is relevant for doing the quantitative magnitudes. Okay? So here is the data as it pertains to the Europe versus US correlations. So you can see that automotive industry, which is not a huge employer of people, but is way up there in terms of its robots uses, but it's the same for the US and Europe. And pretty much all the other industries are pretty close to the 45-degree line. Okay? Now, perhaps more interesting is what's going on in these industries. What else is going on in these industries? So here are the 19 industries, and the yellowish, dirty brown, whatever, dirty yellow line is the exposure to robots measure. And you can see automotive is heading, then plastics and chemicals, metal products, electronics, wood and furniture, not much in education, toys, paper, textiles, glass and ceramics, and so on and so forth. But as I indicated, one concern is that these industries, even though they are housing more robots, are also subject to other changes. So here I'm showing you all sorts of other changes. So this one is Chinese imports. That's what the outer DARON and Hansen paper. So perhaps we're going to have a really hard time distinguishing import competition from robots. So you can see they're not very related. In fact, that's exactly what you should have expected, because Chinese imports were in the low-tech industries, textiles, apparel, toys, wood products, whereas robots are in the higher-tech industries, as I've indicated. The same thing if you look at offshoring. The gray one here, the gray one, or pinkish gray one, that's very unrelated to, so there is an industry-level correlation. The one that happens to be, wasn't originally on our paper when we presented for the first time, more than a year ago. But then with Trump's rise, unfortunately, people kept asking about Mexican. What about Mexican imports? It turns out that Mexican imports are a little bit more correlated with robots because of the automobile industry. So there are a lot of auto parts that are sourced from Mexico. But in the other industries, there isn't much of an association. And we'll deal with all of these things more carefully in the empirical work. But more interestingly, perhaps, these are also not industries that are adopting IT or the capital, they're increasing their capital stock faster. So you can see those are, there are some sectors, there's some sectors where all of these things are going faster, but not in the sectors that are getting more automation on average. Yes, please? Yes, Francis.
One thing that nobody believes in the US, but had an impact in France in what's in the 70s, 80s, is the role of unions.
Is what?
Unions.
Unions.
So not in trends, but think about industries in which unions are strong in the 70s, 80s, suddenly they started to subcontract to us.
That's a great question, and this is on our to-do list. We have not controlled for industry-level unionization. You'll see we control for a lot of things to show you robustness, but we haven't controlled. That's on our to-do list. We'll do that. From the past, exactly. Exactly. So we need to get that data. There's some issues. We haven't done that yet. Good question. So, of course, that was the industry correlation. For us, what matters is the cross-space correlation. So now you can see this is the map of the US where the robots are hitting. And this is the map of the US with Chinese imports. You see that's much more in the south. It's much more on the coasts. But this is much more in the Midwest. This is with routine jobs. Other sort of routine jobs that were automated somewhat earlier. Again, that's a much more coastal phenomenon than this. So the correlation here between unconditional is 0.05. When you put the basic covariance, it's actually negative, slightly negative. Here it's a little bit higher, 0.33, but if you put the baseline covariance, it's 0.11. So you see, the robotization is a very different phenomenon than these other ones that we're talking about. Same thing with offshoring. All right. Now, the problem, and this is a problem for many other papers, some other papers anyway, that have a similar phenomenon, similar empirical approach, like some trade papers like Outerdorn and Hansen, which is that we have a good expectation of where these aggregate trends should hit, but we don't have local measures of where they're hitting because we don't have trade data, for example, at the commuting zone level. Same thing, we don't have robots data at the local level, but perhaps in France we'll have it with Claire. There is Claire. We're hoping. But there isn't that sort of data in the US at the moment. But that sort of creates a problem. So we're saying this is where the exposure to robots is high, but really, show me the money. Are people adopting more robots in places where you're saying exposure to robots is high? Well, it turns out we can't do that, but we can do something that's quite closely related to that, thanks to Lee and Kraft. So they do a huge exercise of scraping the web, and they get the location of all local integrators in the United States. And local robots integrators are essentially, you might think that when you purchase the robots, somebody puts the robots in the mail and it arrives. It doesn't work that way because those are pretty high-tech material. So essentially, robots are installed, programmed, and maintained by local integrators. So it's pretty rare that any company, except like Toyota, that you are actually a robots producer, will be able to do their own robotics back office thing. So therefore, these local integrators have to be in any local labor market where there is any robotics activity. So then we can look at the location of these robots integrators. And let me not show you that in a regression because I want to just go to introduce the regressions in the context of our main results. But this is essentially the regression form with log 1 plus the number of integrators, Poisson model, or the number of integrators. But here is the figure. So each circle here is a commuting zone. The size of the circle is the local, is the baseline employment numbers for that. So it's exactly like Farid's. We're weighting commuting zones by employment so that the estimate has an aggregate interpretation. And the vertical axis is log 1 plus the number of integrators. So you see a fairly clear, positively sloped line. The more exposure to robots, the higher is the number of integrators. So in fact, there is a lot more robotics-related activity. You also see some outliers: Detroit City, Muncie, Defiance, Saginaw, Wilmington. But these outliers don't matter. So take the outliers, so these extreme observations, out, and you get the red line instead. All right, so now we come to our baseline estimation. And the previous table, which I didn't show you, has exactly the same structure, so you can go back and look at those if you want. So here I'm looking at employment. Our main variable is census private employment to population ratio. We look at other ones like from the employer side, from the county business patterns, but it's pretty similar. Now the structure of this table, because a couple of other tables I'm going to show you have the same structure. So this one here is without any controls whatsoever. The only controls that are included are dummies for 9 census divisions, so that you're not comparing the south to the west. Okay? So this just regresses change in the wage from 1990 to 2007 on the exposure to robots from 1993 to 2007. And you get a negative and very well estimated coefficient. This is the negative effect. Quantitative magnitude, I'm going to come to it for a second, so let's not worry about the quantitative magnitude. But the point estimate stability is sort of interesting, and that's what I'm going to focus on. So the next column adds a bunch of demographics. Differences in the educational, differences in the gender, differences in age, differences in the ethnicity composition of the workforce in the baseline. So essentially, you're allowing differential trends in different commuting zones that have different human capital or different compositions. It has very little effect. This goes from minus 0.9 to minus 7.8. Now, this one is much more important. Having more robots is correlated with having more industry. Because, you know, these are industrial robots. If you don't have industry, if your economy is mostly services, that you're not going to have most robots. So if there are any differential trends during these 18-year period, that because, say, some manufacturing industries are going down, that's going to confound the estimates. So here we include share of manufacturing, share of durable manufacturing, share of non-tradables, and share of construction. So the sort of broad industries that could create these differential trends, it has very little effect. And the fourth column here adds all of these competing industry level changes that I mentioned. Chinese imports, Mexican imports, offshoring, routine jobs. That's it. So, but from the fact that I showed you, except for Mexican imports, they're pretty orthogonal. Should have said that's not going to change it, and you see it makes barely any difference. Now, this one, if you were curious about weighting, if you do unweighted, it's the same thing, but it's a slightly bigger because smaller places get affected more. So by weighting things, we're sort of putting more weights on where it should be, so that's good. And here you deal with the outliers. Either you exclude those things or you do other things. It doesn't make any difference. Visually, this is how it looks like. The line that I'm showing, again with the circles and everything, corresponds to the fourth specification here. This one here, which includes all of the controls for trade routinization and offshoring, but it's still weighted. It's this one here. And the red line is when you exclude Detroit, et cetera, et cetera. Wages, same thing. So you have negative effects on wages, exactly the same specifications. This is now estimated on microdata, but it's exactly the same specification. Allow for differential trends. You know, you can see it's not just negative, but pretty tightly estimated and quite stable across these different variations. From a figure point of view, this is how it looks like. Again, if you exclude these outliers, it makes barely any difference. Now, it's now time to say what this means quantitatively. And for that, you need to run the IV. The IV is very similar. The magnitudes change because of the relationship between what's going on in the US and what's going on in Europe. And then you do that. And here is the summary of the slide. Or here's the summary of the quantitative magnitude. So let me go through that quickly. First of all, the easiest thing you can do, and the one that I trust, is to ask the question about what is the effect of robots on a local economy. So in other words, Detroit is exposed to robots, Boston metro area is not. What's the effect of robots over the last 20 years on Detroit relative to Boston? So those are estimates can be directly read from our point estimates, and more importantly, I trust them greatly. Okay? You may not buy it, but I trust them greatly. I'll show you a lot of robustness, and we've done quite a lot of things. These make a lot of sense. And what they imply is that one more robot per 1,000 workers will reduce employment to population ratio in Detroit relative to Boston by 0.37 percentage points, and reduces wages in Detroit relative to Boston by 0.75%. So these are not trivial effects, but they're not huge either. Okay? So they're certainly negative. They're certainly sizable when you take into account the number of robots. One robot is having this effect. But if you multiply it with the total number of robots in the US economy, you're still not going to get a huge amount. Yes, please. Great question. So let me come to that. 2 minutes. Okay. So now, actually, let me take that on now. So I said these are the local effects. What about aggregate implications? So now, even though I trust my estimates, I have to make many more assumptions to go to the aggregate implications. And there are, in particular, at least two. One is that what we are seeing in equilibrium is mobility affected. So it might well be that employment goes down in Detroit because people are moving from Detroit to Boston. Now that we can directly check, we look at mobility and we don't find anything. So surprisingly, in view of the historical literature, but not so surprisingly in relation to recent literature, we don't find much mobility. It's the same thing when you look at the Mian and Sufi, etc. papers. Strange, but true.
But I wanted to ask you a question.
Sure.
Because when in your first paper with Pasquale, you said you destroy jobs,
yes,
but you create new lines in the long
yes,
term. So of course here you have the short-term effect.
Exactly.
You cannot maybe don't have enough time span for the long-term effect. And the second thing is by skills. What can you say by skills?
I'm gonna come to both of those. Those are both excellent questions. Perfect. So the first question relates both to short run and the medium run, and the medium run I'll come back to, but the short run is the second problem, is the more important problem. It might well be that Detroit is going down relative to Boston, but they're both going up. That because of trade, there are a lot of jobs created in Boston. That's why Detroit relative to Boston is going down. Okay? So how can we deal with that? Well, if we ignore it, the same estimates essentially translate into aggregate estimate, because it turns out that in the US, there was essentially one more robot per 1,000 workers. So this is the same. Even if you ignore that positive effect, so this is an overestimate, the effects are not huge. How can we discipline those things? That's where we can use the trade model. And the trade model now depends on a number of parameters in addition to what we are estimating. So what we do is that we set those parameters essentially to values that are pretty common in the literature about elasticities between different varieties, and the labor literature in terms of the Frisch elasticity or the extensive margin of Frisch elasticity. And it turns out that actually they don't really matter all that much. And we go through the same exercise, and we find that when you allow for this trade, it shaves off a little bit from employment, it shaves off quite a little bit from the wage response, but they both remain negative. This is at some level a surprising result, so we worried a lot about why trade isn't doing much. So you can vary all of the parameters, and it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. The key parameter is this pi, which is the cost savings from robots. If you increase that all the way to 100%, which is like incredibly high, that's when you start getting these things close to zero. But even then, you're not getting them close to zero. And one thing that's happening here that's important in interpreting these results is that this is a representative agent model. So there's an income effect on labor supply. So I think the next thing, which we haven't done yet, is to go do this exercise in a trade model with non-representative agents, and that will make some difference. But, all right, but since time is short, let me now show you in 2 minutes what... let me try not to take 5 so that I leave some time for questions also. But I want to just show you that these results are very robust, and they're not really affected, at least by some of the main things that you might have been worried about. The first thing is, well, it might well be that these places were on differential trends to start with. So here we look at the same regression, but with 70 to 90 changes in employment and wages on the left-hand side. So let me show you then in a figure form, there's nothing. So really, it's not that these places were in a downward trend. The second thing, which I like even more, is that instead of looking at these long differences, we break this into 2 periods of roughly 10 years each. So we stuck them together. So now we have 2 observations per commuting zone. So we can run the same regressions. Not surprisingly, you're going to find the same things. Those are these columns. But we can do one more thing, which we can put commuting zone fixed effects, which is essentially you're putting linear time trends. What that does is that it says, let me see whether in a commuting zone, the employment declines come precisely in the decade in which that commuting zone's industries are adopting robots. So automobiles are adopting robots later than electronics. So places that focus in concentrate in electronics should have an earlier decline. Places that have it in autos should have a later decline, and that's exactly what you find. In fact, remarkably, surprisingly, when you do this this estimate with fixed effects, the estimate is very, very similar to the baseline. The other thing, you might worry a lot about autos. So we separate robots in autos from other robots, and we look at the effects of them separately. And again, the effects are pretty similar. So in the stack differences, for example, this is exposure to robots in other industries. This is exposure to robots in autos. Same thing. So that's pretty surprising. I wasn't expecting that, but it turns out that, you know, even though these are very different robots, they have pretty similar effects, and there's nothing special about autos in some level. All right. Now, this is another important thing, is that perhaps it is the case that areas or industries that are adopting robots are making other changes. So here we do 2 exercises. First, we look at capital growth in different industries, and we create a similar index projecting that to the local level, and we control for that. First, it has no impact on employment. So it has no effect on our employment effects or on our wage effects. So those 2 are very separately identified. But more importantly, actually, it doesn't have any negative effects as you might have expected, because an increase in capital stock is more like the gamma in the model. So it takes a labor augmenting form, it increases wages, and it has no negative effects on employment. And then we also construct an index of how much local computer usage there is from the Hart-Hanks data set. And that also has no negative effects on employment. It doesn't change our estimates, but there's a little bit of a negative estimate on wages from computers, but it's not very stable. But what I take from this is that different types of technologies are very different, as the framework based on tasks emphasizes. And in fact, it's really these automation technologies, not capital stock, not even PCs, that have this sort of negative effects. Effects by gender, they're very similar, especially for wages, they're almost identical. Interestingly, the employment effects are a little smaller for women. Why that might be the case, I don't have time to get into it, but we can talk about it. Let me show you the effects on skill groups, which Philippe asked. Essentially, the effects are, these are wages, these are employment, are, you know, it's a little different for employment and wages, but they go all the way to some college for both. For employment, there are some negative effects on college graduates, not so much on wages, and certainly not on postgraduates. So it's really the semi-skilled people who are being affected. And that's also, you see that if you look at the wage distribution, so this estimates different deciles of the wage distribution, you see this affects the bottom of the wage distribution, not the top. But here is the surprising things, in some level, if you want to think about it that way. We don't see the negative, we don't see any positive effects. So ex ante, I would have expected to find perhaps positive effects on the postgraduates. We don't see that. And in fact, you can get another glimpse of that by looking at industries and occupations. So the effects are where they should be. So if you look at industries, it is in manufacturing, it is in the highly robotized manufacturing. There is nothing in other manufacturing, there is nothing in transport, there is nothing in mining. But there are negative effects in supporting industries, on construction, services, retail, business services. Same thing when you look at occupations. It hits for routine manual, blue-collar assembly, and mechanics, but there is also negative effects on clerical workers. So there is a pattern of spillovers that locally these negative shocks are spilling over into some other industries or occupations, and you could redo the quantitative magnitudes taking those into account under some assumptions that those will be local but not translated into aggregate. You get a little bit smaller effects. So that my favorite estimate would be that robots are reducing US employment over the last 20 years by 1/5 of a percentage point employment ratio. So it's a very small effect.
Maybe you do that already, but suppose the counterfactual, I guess you do that with the placebo, the counterfactual that if you had not robotized some segments, maybe more would have been outsourced elsewhere and you would have had a bigger drop. Is that something?
That's right.
So what's your view on this?
So that's a great question. And in some sense, that counterfactual is not here. So we are assuming, we are doing partial derivatives. So we are saying, had the robots not been here, the other changes like IT, which we are controlling for, offshoring routines, they would have been the same. Now, I don't think in this time window that would have made a much difference. Why not? Because econometrically you can see that from the fact that our estimates are essentially identical whether we do or do not control for them. So if you don't control for them, it's more like a total derivative. If you control for them, it's like a partial derivative. And there's a good reason for that, as I explained, which is that technologically routine job replacement, Chinese imports, offshoring were all in these lower tech places. But going forward, of course, that's no longer true. There's going to be much more offshoring in higher tech things potentially. But of course, now competing against that, Chinese wages are greater, etc. So, but I should also add in conclusion that this is all short-term, medium-term. The job creation coming from the competition between race and machine is not here. So I would say there are still some grounds for not being totally pessimistic, but I would say that, again, a task-based frameworks in which automation can definitely have negative effects on employment and wages is the right place to think about these issues.
Another question, Daron.
Sure, of course.
Sometimes Germany has been praised for its education system. They said, you know, what's great in Germany is that, you know, school and firms, you know, you go, you train in firms, and so you have these semi-skilled workers in Germany. And so if you look at the value chain, Germany outsourced much less of the productive segments of the value chain because they had this, maybe also because they have other things. And I was wondering here, I mean, if, you know, kind of one area forward on this agenda is to say, you know, how the various types of education. So here you hint at semi-skilled, unskilled, and how you can make it the less pessimistic possible. What are the ways?
Yeah, so I think that's extremely important, and two things. First of all, that's right. Germany actually adopts a lot of robots, but still has more workers on its factory floor because they work in a complementary fashion. That's partly because of the training system, but the other things. One aspect of this is that they're increasing their exports a lot, which is not so relevant for the US. So it might be that robots are cutting costs, and then through the what I call the price productivity effect, they're expanding because they're facing more elastic demand than the US company. I don't know. But interestingly, there's just a paper that came out as a working paper a month ago by 3 German researchers that take this methodology with the same sort of data but applied to the local German markets, and they don't find negative effects, which is that these robots are being used in a more complementary fashion.
So, I think very directly related to Philippe's question would be, again, the role of education, but again, understanding what are the firms or the industries that started using robots.
That's what we would love to do with Claire if the French data gods cooperate with us.
So more precisely, my question would be, is it, because you could say, okay, it's the lack of skilled workers, or it's the abundance of skilled workers that helps you implementing the stuff, or forces you, because very much in the spirit of my union question. So what's driving the influx of robots in the first place in the workplace? And because in that respect, the question about how can you accommodate the shock, is education the solution or not? Thinking also about the way you can recompose tasks in the face of
yeah. So I think that's a great question, and it's one of the things that I love talking about because I think it's crucial, and we know nothing about it. Meaning that what type of skills these. Somebody disagreed with that. What types of skills these new automation technologies, robots, AIs are complementary to? Is it numeracy skills? Is it communication? So I've been trying to get firm-level data on AI and workers from several different companies in order to answer that question, or not answer, but investigate that question. We've made a little bit of progress in getting some data, but if you have other ideas, I would love to hear them. Yes, Andre?
I was wondering about the difference between having special guy coming from Mars and working in a society or a robot. In the sense that if I take a simple example, maybe it's not your definition of robots, but we have a long discussion in the France about automatization of public transportation. But when I see the reason why it's slow, because there is a sunk cost. Before you put automated metro, okay, you have to have a lot of guys thinking computer. The second thing is liability. Drivers are not liable because, okay, not because of their fault, there are the union that was mentioned, but there is also the fact that people are jumping on the track and then they don't do that when they're in a robot. 914, nobody killed himself. The third thing, the discussion is that conviviality and so on, which has also a counterpart. So my question is that a counterpart in a company? Is there a sunk cost? And why? I don't think you have a sunk cost in your production function. So if when you put one robot, it costs a lot. Okay. The second thing is liability, and the third thing is that maybe some invention of some people, but it's called agglomeration economies, in the sense that one worker has an impact on the other worker because you speak, you come with your technology and so on. And robots, maybe in a late stage, they will do that, but for the moment, they don't do that at all. So
all of those are excellent points, and I don't know. Certainly, there are similarities between what a robot does and what a very, very cheap laborer who could have done the same task, like an immigrant in some lines would do. So that would be very similar within task substitution. So there's some similarity there. But as you said, robots also change other aspects of the production process. So if you interview workers who are still in manufacturing factories and are working with robots, they're very happy, because the robots are actually doing the less pleasant tasks that were harder, and those workers have kept their jobs and their productivity has probably increased. So the collegiality that's not being missed that much, because but that's just one one aspect of that. So there are many other different aspects. I think those are very interesting. Robots is, here industrial robots, AI, some of the companies are using AI precisely to facilitate, for example, worker-to-worker information flows. So that when you encounter a problem, you don't try to go to your supervisor or find some workers. So there's an AI technology that helps you sort of solve that problem. So there are many different uses of these new technologies. Some of them are more replacing, some of them are more complementary. So I think all of them need to be somewhat more studied in a somewhat greater detail than this more bird-eye view that we have here, of course.
So that's somewhat unrelated to your paper, but if I want to extrapolate what you did for 20 years, what would you change? It's not comment on your paper, the paper is very good, but what would you do in the next paper to say, okay, now I am going to do a simulation of what is going on in the next?
Yeah, I mean, I think simulations, you can do anything. You have a lot of freedom. So, but here is the one that I would put most emphasis on, and that relates to what Philippe was asking. So, this is, the first paper that I wrote with Pasquale on this topic was more of a theoretical framework, and was asking. Sorry, we're running late, and I'm telling you about another paper. 30 seconds, but I'm trying to answer Andre's question. It's not my fault. It's his fault. So it asked conceptually the following question. Automation has been going on for 200 years. How come we have this somewhat balanced growth where workers are replaced by machines, but still there's a lot of employment, still labor share is high, wages are growing? And the answer is because that was the race between machine and man that Farid was sort of referring to. At the same time as you're replacing workers in some existing tasks, you're also creating new tasks. So it's a dynamic process of comparative advantage dynamically shifting, and that happens with endogenous technological change. So that's not here because we're making cross comparisons and it's a short amount of period. So the question that's in the background in some senses, how good are we going to be at creating new tasks, new jobs, new occupations? And two questions there. One is, are there incentives for firms to do that? The theoretical framework says there will be, but not necessarily optimal incentives. Second is Francis's question, well, that new tasks, new jobs require new skills. We got out of the agricultural mechanization because that happened at the same time as the high school movement. Perhaps if we didn't have the high school movement, the transition out of agriculture to cities would have been much harder, but we're not doing the same thing. We're actually going backwards in many dimensions of the education. So there are some questions there. But all of that notwithstanding, if you look at the last 3 decades, for example, that's what this figure does. Let me not go into the details, but what it says is that actually about half of the all employment growth in the United States came from new tasks or occupations in which there are important new activities. So this issue of new tasks, new occupations is actually quite important even in the recent past. Claire?